If you had told Maren Doyle 6 months ago that she'd be spending her 53rd birthday on her hands and knees in a dead woman's bakery, scrubbing grease off a floor that hadn't seen a mop since the Obama administration, she would have laughed at you. She wasn't laughing now. But before we get into what Maren found inside that old building on Sycamore Street, and trust me, you are going to want to hear this. If you're new here, welcome to Grand Stories. Hit that subscribe button and stick around, because this one is going to stay with you. The bakery had been closed for 11 years. Everyone in Clover Mills, Tennessee knew the name Doyle's Sweet Corner. For 32 years, it had sat at the edge of downtown, between the hardware store and the post office, pumping the smell of cinnamon rolls and brown sugar into the street every morning before 6. Maren's mother, Vera Doyle, had opened it herself at the age of 40 with nothing but $200 saved from cleaning hotel rooms and a recipe box her own mother had left her. Vera had died 14 months ago, quickly and without warning, a stroke, in her sleep at 71. She never got to say goodbye to anyone. She certainly never got to explain the bakery. And that was the problem. Because the bakery, it turned out, was not just a bakery. Maren had driven from Nashville to Clover Mills in a car that was making a sound she couldn't afford to fix. She had $214 in her checking account. She had a storage unit in East Nashville stuffed with the furniture from the house she used to share with her husband. Ex-husband now, as of 8 months ago. And a one-bedroom apartment that she was already 2 weeks behind on rent for. She was not someone who was doing well. She would be the first to tell you that. The divorce had taken 3 years to complete and had cost her nearly everything she'd spent 2 decades building. Maren had put her ex-husband through graduate school, worked double shifts at the medical billing office so he could finish his dissertation, turned down a job offer in Chicago because he didn't want to leave Tennessee. She had done everything right, according to the contract she thought they'd both agreed to. And then, at 51, she found out he'd been seeing someone else for 4 years. Someone younger. Someone who had never sacrificed anything for him at all. The judge had divided the assets cleanly down the middle. What looked fair on paper felt devastating in practice. Maren walked away with half of what they'd built, which turned out to be not very much, because what they'd built had mostly gone toward his student loans and their lifestyle. She didn't tell anyone in Clover Mills any of this. As far as her mother's old neighbors knew, Maren was just a woman coming back to clean out her late mother's bakery before the building was sold. Her brother Silas had been very clear about the plan. Silas was 56, 3 years older than Maren, and he had always been the one who handled things. At least, that's what he believed about himself. He lived in Knoxville now, drove a Lexus, and had made it abundantly clear at their mother's funeral that he had no interest in sentimentality. The building's worth something, he'd told her, right there in the parking lot of the church, still in his good suit. The property alone. We list it, split what we get, and move on. Mom would understand. Maren had nodded. She was too tired to argue. Silas had found a buyer, a developer who wanted to put a sandwich franchise in the space. The offer was $148,000 for the building and the land. Silas had already spoken to an attorney. All Maren had to do was sign, but before they could close, the building had to be cleaned out, inspected, and cleared of all personal property. Silas could not come. He had a conference in Atlanta, then a thing in Charlotte, then something else he didn't fully explain. Maren could come, couldn't she? She was between things right now, wasn't she? He didn't say unemployed. He had the decency not to say it out loud. So Maren drove 4 hours from Nashville in the car with the sound, and she pulled up in front of Doyle's Sweet Corner on a Tuesday morning in March, and she stood on the sidewalk looking at the faded hand-painted sign in the window. Closed, in her mother's handwriting. Placed there in 2013 and never taken down. And she felt something crack open somewhere behind her ribs. She had a key. Her mother had always kept a spare at the bottom of a ceramic roster on the back porch. It was still there. Of course it was. The inside was exactly what you'd expect of a place no one had entered in over a decade. Dust on everything. A fine white powder across the display cases that might have been flour, might have been thyme. The refrigerators had been emptied and unplugged before her mother locked up. Thank God. But the smell was still a kind of closed-in sweetness gone stale, like a birthday cake found at the back of a closet. Maren stood in the doorway for a long moment, just breathing it. There was her mother's apron still hanging on the hook by the back door. There was the little chalkboard menu her mother updated every week for 32 years. Still listing the Tuesday special. Peach crumble $2.50. Comes with coffee. There was the corner booth where Maren had done her homework as a kid, sitting on the cracked red vinyl with a glass of milk and her spelling lists while Vera wiped down tables around her. She pressed her hand flat against the glass case and left a print in the dust. Then she picked up the trash bags she'd brought from home and got to work. She had given herself 3 days. It took less than one to understand that 3 days was not going to be enough. The front of the bakery was manageable. Display cases, small equipment, the old register. None of it worth much, all of it going to the donation center or the dumpster. But the back was a different story. Her mother had used every inch of that kitchen. 32 years of a small business run by one stubborn woman meant 32 years of accumulated everything. Industrial mixers, flour sifters, cake molds stacked to the ceiling, boxes of napkins unopened from 2009, a drawer of rubber bands that had all fused into a single mass. By Wednesday afternoon, Maren had filled 14 bags and hadn't even touched the pantry. The pantry was a narrow room off the main kitchen, barely bigger than a closet, lined floor and its angles. Her mother had kept it meticulously organized once. Now the labels on the canned goods had yellowed and peeled, and there was a mouse hole in the baseboard that Maren chose not to think too hard about. She started on the lower shelves, pulling things out and sorting them. Trash, donate, trash, trash, and that's when her knee came down on a board that moved. Just slightly wrong. She looked down, pressed her hand to the floor, pressed again. The board flexed. Not the way a warped board flexes with age, but the way something flexes when it's meant to. Maren sat back on her heels and looked at the floor of that pantry for a long time. Then she went and got the flathead screwdriver from the little tool kit she kept in her car. It took her 20 minutes to find the seam. Her mother had been careful. The cut in the floor was tight, barely visible, running along the natural grain of the wood, so it looked like nothing more than a crack. But once Maren found the edge and worked the screwdriver in, she felt the resistance of a hinge on the far side. She lifted it. Underneath was a metal box. Not a safe, nothing with a combination or a lock, just a heavy-gauge steel storage box, the kind sold at hardware stores for important documents. It had a simple latch, and when Maren opened it, sitting cross-legged on the floor of a dark pantry with the smell of old flour around her, the first thing that fell out was a piece of paper folded 3 times. She unfolded it. It was a letter, in her mother's handwriting. Maren, it started. Not Silas and Maren, just Maren. If you're reading this, you found it. I always thought it would be you. Your brother never did like cleaning. Maren laughed. She laughed until she cried. Right there on the pantry floor, because that was her mother, practical and pointed even from beyond the grave. Then she wiped her face and kept reading. The letter was 4 pages. In it, Maren Doyle explained several things that Maren had never known. The first was about a man named Clifton Marsh, who had come into the bakery in the winter of 1998 with a $5 bill, a black eye, and a child on his hip. He'd asked for the cheapest thing on the menu. Vera had given him a full breakfast and told him it was on the house. He'd tried to refuse. She'd told him she didn't have time for arguing. He'd sat in booth 3 for 2 hours, feeding bites of scrambled egg to his daughter, and when he'd finally stood to leave, his eyes had been wet. He'd come back the following month with a $10 bill and a thank you card. He was back on his feet, he said. He just wanted her to know. Vera had put the 10 in a coffee can on the shelf. The second was about a woman named Helen, who had no last name that Vera ever knew, who had sat outside the bakery in the cold one morning. This was 2003, and when Vera had brought her a cup of coffee and a roll, Helen had told her she had nowhere to sleep that night. Vera had called the women's shelter, stayed on hold for 45 minutes, made sure Helen got in. The third was about a teenager named Marcus who'd come in after school every day for a semester, always buying the smallest thing, always sitting alone, always looking like someone who was trying very hard not to fall apart. Vera had learned eventually that his parents were going through a bitter divorce and that he was the middle child, the one nobody remembered to check on. She had started putting an extra cookie in a bag and leaving it at his usual table before he arrived. She never said anything about it, neither did he. These were not the only stories, not by a long stretch. The coffee can, which was not actually a coffee can anymore but a steel box under the floor, contained what Vera called her accounts, not financial accounts. A notebook, 40 pages, front and back, written in the same tight slanted hand that had written every chalkboard menu and every birthday card for 50 years' names, dates, small notes. Clifton Marsh, December 98, breakfast for 2. Daughter's name was Lily. They were okay. Helen, February 03, no last name. Called Shelter on Birchwood. She got in. Marcus, fall semester 2007. Extra snickerdoodle every Tuesday and Thursday. Stopped coming in April. Hope he made it. Page after page of them, there were 63 entries. At the bottom of the box beneath the notebook were 2 envelopes. The first was addressed to Silas. Inside was a letter and a check for $22,000. The second was addressed to Maren. Inside was a letter, a check, and something else. A folded piece of paper that turned out to be the deed to the building on Sycamore Street, already signed over, with a note from a Clover Mills attorney dated 4 months before Vera's death. The building wasn't part of the estate. It had never been part of the estate. Vera had transferred it directly to Maren 16 months before she died, quietly and legally, without telling either of her children. Silas's attorney, the one handling the sale, had somehow missed this, or perhaps no one had looked closely enough. Either way, the developer's offer, the conference in Atlanta, the Lexus in the driveway. None of it mattered because the building did not belong to Silas at all. It belonged to Maren, and the check in her envelope was for $22,000 as well. The same as Silas's, because Vera had believed in fairness, along with a second note in her mother's handwriting that said simply, "The bakery was always meant to be yours. I just needed to wait until you needed it." Now, this is the part of the story we need you to sit with for a moment, because this is where it would be easy to focus on Silas. On his phone calls over the next 72 hours, which were first confused, then loud, then eventually just quiet. On the conversation Maren had with the attorney, who confirmed everything Vera had done and had done it correctly. On the way Silas eventually accepted it, not graciously, not quickly, but eventually, because there was nothing else to accept. It would be easy to make Silas the villain of this story, and maybe he earned that role a little. But that's not really what the story is about. What the story is about is Vera Doyle, who cleaned hotel rooms for 7 years to save $200 and then spent the next 32 years feeding people who couldn't afford to be fed, without ever once asking for credit or recognition. Who kept a notebook, not for herself, not for posterity, but because she believed each person deserved to be remembered. Who knew somehow that the right moment to give her daughter something solid was the moment when Maren had nothing left to stand on. That's what the notebook was, if you think about it. Not a list of charity cases, not a record of good deeds. It was evidence. Evidence that her mother had spent a lifetime noticing people, and that noticing, really noticing, not the polite kind that looks away afterward, was the whole thing. That was the whole inheritance. Maren did not reopen the bakery right away. She spent 3 weeks in Clover Mills, first finishing the cleanup, then sitting with the attorney, then sitting with a contractor who walked the kitchen and told her what it would take. She called in sick to a job she hadn't mentioned to anyone yet, a part-time position at a medical records office in Nashville, the kind of job you take when you're just trying to stay afloat. And she sat in booth 3 with a cup of coffee from the gas station across the street and her mother's notebook open on the table in front of her. She read every entry. She read about Clifton and Helen and Marcus. She read about a couple named the Pipers who'd come in the week their house burned down and sat for 3 hours, while Vera kept refilling their cups without charging them. She read about a man named Odell who'd walked in one afternoon in 2011 and told Vera he was thinking about not going home. Not in those words, but Vera had understood. She'd sat with him for 2 hours. She'd called his daughter. He came back the next spring with his granddaughter, the entry said. She wanted a chocolate cupcake. He looked okay. Maren sat in that booth and felt something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't grief, exactly. It was more like discovering that the person you thought you knew had a whole other room inside them that they'd never shown you, and realizing that the room was beautiful, and that you'd always had a key to it, you'd just never thought to look. She called her best friend, Claudette, in Nashville. She called at midnight, which was fine because Claudette was a night person and had told Maren 11 times over the past year that she could call whenever she needed to. "I think I'm going to stay," Maren said. Claudette was quiet for a moment. "In Clover Mills? In the bakery?" A longer pause. "Do you know how to run a bakery?" "I know how to clean hotel rooms," Maren said. Mom figured the rest out as she went. The contractor said the kitchen would take 6 weeks to bring up to code. It took 9. That was fine. Maren had learned that things take longer than they're supposed to, and that this is usually not the catastrophe it feels like at first. She drove back to Nashville, got out of her apartment lease with a fee she couldn't really afford, packed everything from the storage unit into a moving truck, and drove it back to Clover Mills. She stayed in her mother's old house, which was rented, and not part of any of this, but the tenant had just left and the landlord gave her a month free while he found someone new. She used the $22,000 carefully. The contractor first, then the equipment she absolutely needed, then 3 months of operating costs held in reserve. She found her mother's recipe box in the back of a kitchen cabinet, behind a Dutch oven and a stack of springform pans. It was a wooden box, the paint worn off the corners, the index cards inside soft with age and use. Maren recognized the recipes before she even read the labels. The cinnamon rolls, the peach crumb, the brown sugar pound cake that had been the Tuesday special for 20 years. She sat on the kitchen floor with the recipe box in her lap and let herself cry, and this time it didn't feel like grief. It felt like something more complicated than grief. Like being handed something precious that you didn't know had been waiting for you. Doyle's Sweet Corner reopened on a Saturday morning in September, almost 2 years to the month after Vera had died. Maren hadn't done much advertising. She didn't have a budget for it, and honestly, she wasn't sure Clover Mills needed to be told. The smell alone, she figured, would do the work. She started the cinnamon rolls at 4 in the morning the way her mother always had. And by 5:30 the scent was finding its way out through the old ventilation and down the sidewalk. And when she unlocked the front door at 7, there were already 6 people standing outside. One of them was an older man she didn't recognize, who introduced himself as Clifton Marsh. He was in his mid-50s now, heavy-set, with work-roughened hands and a kind face. He said he'd heard the bakery was reopening, said he'd driven 40 minutes from where he lived now because he wanted to be there on the first day. Said he wasn't sure he could explain why. Exactly. Maren brought him to booth 3. She brought him coffee and a cinnamon roll and sat across from him for a moment, because she wasn't that busy yet, the morning crowd still trickling in, and she said, "My mother wrote about you." He looked up. "In a notebook," she said. She kept a notebook. December of 1998. Breakfast for 2. She wrote that your daughter's name was Lily. Clifton Marsh put his coffee cup down very carefully. His jaw moved once. He looked at the table. She remembered that, he said. It was not really a question. She remembered everyone, Maren said. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "Lily's got her own kids now. 2 of them. I'm a grandfather." He said it like he still couldn't quite believe it. She'd have loved hearing that, Maren said. They sat there together for a minute or two, in the comfortable silence of people who understand each other without needing to. And then the bell over the door rang, and more people came in, and Maren stood up to get back to work. Before we tell you the last part of this story, if you've been watching with us for a while, you know that we don't do easy endings here at Grand Stories. We don't tie things in a bow and pretend life straightened itself out. But we also don't look away from the moments when something real and good actually happens, because those moments deserve to be seen just as much as the hard ones. So here it is. It was a Thursday morning in early October, about 3 weeks after the reopening, and Maren was behind the counter when the door opened and a woman came in who looked. And Maren recognized this the way you only recognize it when you've been there yourself. Like someone who was holding herself together with whatever she had left. She was maybe 45. She had a child with her, a boy of about 7, pressed close to her side and looked around at the display case with wide eyes. She asked for the cheapest thing on the menu. Maren looked at her for just a moment. Then she looked at the boy. "What's your name?" she asked him. He said his name was Cooper. "Cooper," she said, "I think you look like a cinnamon roll person. Would that be okay with your mom?" The woman started to say something about the price. Maren shook her head slightly, not dismissively, gently, the way her mother must have done it once. "It's on the house," Maren said. "We have a rule here. First visit's always on the house." They didn't have that rule. She'd just made it up. But standing there, watching that woman's face change, just slightly, just for a second, that particular change that happens when someone who has been bracing for the world to be hard finds out that today, just today, it isn't. Maren understood something she hadn't been able to put into words until that exact moment. Her mother hadn't been keeping a list. She'd been keeping the light on. And she hadn't left Maren the bakery so that Maren would have something. She'd left her the bakery so that Maren would have something to give. Cooper sat in booth 3 and ate his cinnamon roll with both hands, and his mother wrapped her hands around a cup of coffee and looked out the window at the street, and the morning sun came through the old glass and laid itself across the floor in long, warm stripes, and Maren Doyle stood behind the counter of her mother's bakery. her bakery now and thought, okay, I can do this. If this story meant something to you, leave us a comment below. Tell us about someone who kept the light on for you when you needed it. And if you're new here, please subscribe. We tell stories like this one every week, stories about ordinary people who do extraordinary things in the quietest ways. We'll see you in the next one.